What's happening, everybody? We got another UFC fight card this weekend. Barboza and Murphy in the main event. I'm going to break down everything that you guys need to know to hopefully profit building some DFS lineups this weekend. So if you can do me a favor while you're watching this, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for our MMA package at Stokastic.com, which has helped me be really profitable building my MMA DFS lineups this year, sign up using the link below in the description box. You could build all your lineups on our site. You could simulate those lineups on our site. And then, of course, we got things like fighter projections, ownership projections, all included in that as well. I'll be walking you through my initial run of lineups and what my exposures are looking like in our sims here in a second. Also, a giveaway. Last week, we did a giveaway, which was guess which fighter was going to score the most fantasy points. It was giving away a free Odd Shopper subscription to our betting site for one person who got the answer correct. And almost everybody in the chat answered either Despain or answered Rombetsky. And what ended up happening was not only were neither of them the high score, neither of them even ended up winning. They were both pretty big upsets last week. So let's run it back. Let me know in the comments below, guys, which fighter this week is going to score the most fantasy points. And then one person who gets the answer correct, I'll give you a free subscription to our Odd Shopper betting site. But let's start getting into the fights here, beginning with the main event where we have Edson Barboza taking on Lerone Murphy. And you know, I've been in the past pretty, just as a general rule, down on fighters who are aging. And that is something that we have here on Edson Barboza. He is 38 years old. Lerone Murphy is definitely the younger of the two fighters. But whether it's a coincidence or not, we've seen a ton this year since the absence of USADA and the drug testing policy that, there is still drug testing in place, but it's not USADA that's running it anymore. We've seen a lot of older fighters have impressive performances. We've seen a lot of older fighters run back the clock and look like the prime version of themselves. And it's something that I think we have to take into consideration with Edson Barboza, who even at an advanced age at 38 years old, has still looked good in his recent fights. The last couple of outings for Edson Barboza, an early KO win over Billy Quarantillo, who was super popular. Billy Quarantillo was chalk in that fight card. That was the Holloway versus Allen main event card that we had last year. And then also, we saw the fight against Sadiq Youssef, where Edson Barboza got his ass kicked in the first round of that fight. If we go ahead and look at the stats for that one, what were the striking numbers in the first round? Yeah, Sadiq Youssef ends up outlanding Edson Barboza 42-13 on the significant strikes in the first round. It was arguably a 10-7 round. Youssef had Barboza hurt really, really bad, and Barboza rallied back to end up winning that fight. And then when it comes to the fight against Murphy, I think Barboza is the better all-around, more well-rounded fighter. Typically, there are fighters who are able to implement a wrestling and grappling advantage over Edson Barboza. I don't even know that Murphy has a wrestling and grappling advantage in this fight. Edson Barboza on paper does have a 75% takedown defense, whereas Murphy only defends takedowns at a 46% clip. I think there might even be a path for Barboza to land takedowns of his own. So to me, the only real knock that I would have against Barboza in this fight is his age at 38 years old. Is he just past his prime, and is he going to start to fade? But we haven't seen much indication of that in his last couple of fights. He's the underdog. This is also a card where it's very, very difficult to find cheap fighters to roster. So I do think it should be a competitive fight, but I lean slightly towards Edson Barboza, who's the more proven of the two fighters. And then because it is so difficult to find cheap value on the slate, I'm going to be a little bit higher on the Barboza side. I do think this is a very great main event to be targeting. I'm a little bit heavier here on Barboza, about 60-40. It's not like I think he's a lock to win or anything like that. I just think he makes a little bit more sense from a DFS perspective. So I'll be a little bit higher on Edson Barboza in this fight. No bets on this fight. And in general, there aren't that many fights that I've bet on in total. I only have 2 bets for this week's card, which I'll be going through as we go here. It's a really tough card to bet, in my opinion, but there are definitely some good angles for DFS purposes. And this should be another really entertaining fight. Chaos Williams against Carlston Harris. As far as Carlston Harris goes, I think he's probably going to be grappling dependent to win this fight, because when it plays out on the feet, Chaos Williams has a lot more power. He also has a lot more output. He lands 5.77 significant strikes per minute, just the 2.93 for Carlston Harris. So while Harris does have a grappling advantage on paper, Chaos Williams has an 80% takedown defense. So I'm not sure that Carlston Harris is going to be able to get this fight to the mat, but if he is able to, I think he could have a pretty good DraftKings score. So whoever wins this fight, I think, should score well. I think Chaos Williams is very live for an early knockout. And then on the Carlston Harris side, if he should get the fight to the ground, he's live for a submission. So Chaos Williams, I currently have in 31% of lineups. And then Carlston Harris on the other side, I have in a little bit less, but also 30% of lineups. Good fight to be targeting. It's also priced in the mid-range, which to me is really important for this card because when I mentioned before that there aren't that many cheap fighters that I like, it does a couple of things then because if there aren't cheap fighters I like, it makes it really hard to spend up for the most expensive fighters. And then I'm looking more towards the mid range to build my lineups around so I don't have to be taking chances on punts that I don't feel great about. And I do think there are a lot of sneaky fights to target in the mid range, or this fight, which isn't necessarily sneaky, but just one that I think has a very good chance to finish and the winner should score well. But Chaos Williams is going to be my pick and my slightly preferred option to play in DFS. Another really good fight to target, Themba Gorimbo taking on Ramiz Brahimaj. And there's some concerns on both sides of this fight as far as Brahimaj is concerned. We have not seen him fight since February 26th of 2022. And that was a fight over Michael Gilmore that he won, which Michael Gilmore is so far from a UFC caliber talent that that fight even barely counts as actual competition. So the last real fight that we saw Brahimaj win was against Sasha Palatnikov all the way back in August of 2021. So as far as I'm concerned, it's 3 years since we've seen an actual relevant win out of Brahimaj. He's been injured since then. He's dealt with back issues. And then on the other side of the fight, we've got a fan favorite in Themba Gorimbo who went viral because The Rock gifted him a house. And it was a pretty good feel-good story that ended up coming out of it. And since then, Gorimbo's looked pretty good in his fights as well. His last couple of outings, he had a good win over Takashi Sato. And then also we saw him knock out Pete Rodriguez in the feet in his next fight. And that was one where, at least on paper, I thought that if Pete Rodriguez won, it was likely going to be from striking. If Themba ended up winning, I thought it was going to come from the grappling. And then instead, we just saw Gorimbo come out and just instantly KO Pete Rodriguez in 30 seconds in that fight. So maybe his striking a little bit underrated here. I don't know exactly what we're getting out of Brahimaj after the long layoff, but Themba Gorimbo is somebody who could get hurt on the feet. He's also sloppy on the ground. So there are times where we can see him be submitted. And I think that's something he opens himself up to a risk at, especially when we see him grapple and wrestle as much as he does. So the way I think this fight is going to play out, more often than not, I do think Themba Gorimbo wins. But in the first round, it's anybody's fight. I do think this fight is also live to finish early. And that's where Brahimaj could potentially be dangerous. I could see him either getting a knockout in the first round or potentially submitting Gorimbo. And when you consider once again that there aren't that many cheap fighters to target and this fight is priced in the mid-range, I'm liking both sides of this fight. I currently have a little bit more of Brahimaj, which is strictly due to the price point. I am picking Gorimbo to win. I think he wins either by second or third round submission, most likely. But this is currently a fight that I have a massive amount of exposure to. 37% of Gorimbo, 43% of Brahimaj. So nearly 80% of my lineups are made up with one side of this fight. Brahimaj, once again, just because of the price point, I'm going to play a little bit more of him, even though I'm picking Gorimbo to win. It's hard to find these cheap fighters, not only that are live to win, but if they win, it's hard for me to find ones that I even think would score well potentially in a win. So a good fight to be targeting there for sure. I think it should finish. I think the winner scores well. Adrian Yanez taking on Vinicius Salvador, and this should not be a competitive fight in my opinion. I think Yanez should win pretty easily. As far as the recent fights for Yanez, we've seen him in a couple of difficult matchups, got KO'd by Rob Font, got KO'd by Jonathan Martinez by leg kicks. He looked fairly terrible in both of those fights, but Salvador is arguably the easiest fight that he's ever had in the UFC, while on the other side with Salvador, I think this is pretty clearly the most difficult fight that he's had in the UFC. And if you look at the recent matchups for him, it doesn't make all that much sense from a matchmaker perspective, other than they're trying to get Adrian Yanez a win here. So last couple of fights, we saw Salvador lose against Victor Altamirano, also lost against CJ Vergara. And these are two fighters that Yanez would probably be like minus 300 favorites against himself. So Adrian Yanez, I'm picking him pretty confidently to win this fight. I think he's pretty live to finish the fight as well. The problem is just at his price point, there are so many fighters that I think are likely to win as pay-up options, and he's also going to be fairly popular. So 35% projected ownership coming in on Yanez. I'm confident he wins, but I'm not getting up to him as much as the field is. I only have 25% of Yanez in my first run of lineups. Probably where I'll be at is a little bit underweight to the field on him. And then I'm just going to hope that if he finishes, it comes in the second or third round as opposed to it being a first round finish. Luana Pinheiro taking on Angela Hill. And this is a fight that I really like a contrarian angle on. So talking before about how I'm looking at some of these fights I want to be targeting in the mid-range, And overall, I do think Pinheiro is the more talented fighter than Angela Hill. I think that she is very, very likely to win the first round, maybe even the second round of this fight. At the very least, she's likely to win the early stages of the second round. The problem with Pinheiro is that she is terrible cardio. And we've seen time and time again, she looks like a world beater, potentially even a title contender in the first round of some of her fights, only for her to drop off and her cardio to totally fail her in the later stages of fight. So that happened in her last fight against Amanda Ribas. Pinheiro looked great in the first round. She loses the second round, and then Ribas finishes her in the third round. I think we could see something similar in the Angela Hill matchup here. And then something else that could happen as well. If the first round Pinheiro wins and the second round is competitive, I think we could see Angela Hill really put her foot on the gas pedal and really put out a ton of output to try to put a stamp on the win, either with a 10-8 third round or potentially even a finish there. And because of the cardio advantage Angela Hill has, I like a betting angle for this fight. I bet Angela Hill 24-1 to win in the third round. I think that is a very live option for Angela Hill to win. And then also as a DraftKings scorer, Angela Hill's kind of sneaky to score big fantasy points. The reason being is we see this all the time in women's MMA fights where if there is a fight that takes place on the feet and there's a lot of back and forth striking exchanges, sometimes it's almost like a pinball multiplier, the way that the stat keepers will count some of the significant strikes in those fights. So you see Angela Hill lands about 5.5 significant strikes per minute. And we've seen some fights where she just landed massive output. For example, a few fights ago against Amelie Ducati, who's also fighting on this card, Angela Hill was credited with 182 significant strikes. She didn't land 182 damaging strikes. It was a lot of pitter-patter that was being counted as significant strikes. That could be how this fight plays out as well. Angela Hill is not expected to be all that popular, right around 20% projected owned. And because it is, once again, hard to find cheap fighters to roster, I'm liking Angela Hill in the mid-range. I have her in 35% of my lineups right now. One of my favorite contrarian options to differentiate lineups on the slate. Moving down here, we've got Victor Martinez taking on Tom Nolan. To me, this fight is extremely similar to the Adrian Yanez and Vinicius Salvador fight, where the UFC has made this matchup to try to get Tom Nolan a win. Tom Nolan's a fighter from the Contender Series, which is typically the fighters that we've seen the UFC kind of prioritize. And when we saw Tom Nolan on the Contender Series, a lot of output, a lot of damage early. He ends up getting a finish in a minute and a half, 2 knockdowns, as well as 13 significant strikes landed in just a minute and a half. Then his subsequent fight against Nicholas Mota, he got KO'd, got caught in that fight. And Mota is somebody who I don't rate all that highly as a UFC fighter. I think he's probably just a borderline UFC fighter. And that's kind of how I rate Tom Nolan as well. But Victor Martinez doesn't belong anywhere near the UFC. And I think if Tom Nolan keeps a high pace and pressure, as we've always seen him do throughout his career, not only do I think he probably gets an early finish over Victor Martinez, but I think it should come with a very, very big DraftKings score. We have seen Tom Nolan the limited time he's been in the octagon land north of 10 significant strikes per minute. So of all the pay-up options that we have to target on the slate, Tom Nolan is my favorite. He's also projected to be popular, but not crazy popular. There's other fighters on the high end that are projected for more ownership. So for example, talked about Adrian Yanez before. He's projected for 35% ownership. We've also got Omar Sy projected for 30% ownership. So with Tom Nolan projected just under 20% ownership, not only do I like the upside of him, but I also like that he's somebody that the field isn't quite getting to as much as the other pay-up options. So Tom Nolan, that's the pay-up option that I'm going to be getting to the most to differentiate some of my lineups. That is assuming that his lower ownership holds relative to the other pay-up options. Omar Sy taking on Tuco Tokos. And Sy is a massive favorite. This is a fight that was put together on late notice. So Tuco's taking this fight on 5 days notice or something along those lines. It took a while for this fight to get added to the DraftKings player pool, which we've seen them do more of recently. I think it's a result of, if you guys remember, there was a point in time where new fights would get made and the fights would just get added to the DraftKings player pool almost immediately. And oftentimes the fight pricing would be way out of line from what the betting odds were, which is typically what DraftKings uses to set the pricing. So now they wait a little bit longer for the betting odds to come out before they set the DFS prices. So this is a fight where maybe a couple years ago, if it was made, we would have been able to roster Sy at 8,300, 8,400 or something like that. That's not the case, though. He's opened up as a nearly minus 600 favorite at some books, and as a result, he's $9,600. So I'm going to favor him pretty clearly to win over Tukos and probably to get an early finish in the fight, but it's always difficult to get up to these $9,600 fighters, especially on a card like this where there aren't that many cheap punt plays to be liking. So I'm not going to totally write off Omar Sy. I'm just prioritizing some other pay-up options. So I've been just under 30% of my lineups, and then no real interest in Tukos as an underdog who I think is drawing pretty thin to end up winning this fight. So I don't typically like to target fighters who I think have a very limited path to victory. Moving on here, we have Melissa Gatto against Tamaris Vidal. And Vidal was pretty popular in her UFC debut against Montserrat Rendon. She was something like a minus 250 favorite in that spot. And what did we learn? We learned that she has no takedown defense or grappling in that fight. So we saw Rendon land 3 takedowns and about 5 minutes of control time. And now Vidal draws an even more difficult matchup here because I do think that Melissa Gatto is a better wrestler and a better grappler than what we've seen Vidal face in the past. So when you consider how much she struggled in the wrestling department in her last fight, defending takedowns just 40% now, and then you got somebody in Gatto who typically hasn't been the highest output wrestler, but I do think she should come in with a smart game plan, look to wrestle and grapple in this fight. And if she does do that, I think she wins a decision fairly comfortably. But as a pay-up option, it's going to be hard for me to really get there. So I have Gatto in, only around 10% of my lineup. So not somebody I'm going to be prioritizing. And then Vidal, don't really like her as a pay down option. I guess she could be live to hurt Gatto on the feet, but how many opportunities is she going to get when I do think that Gatto probably floors her pretty quickly with her wrestling and gets this fight to the ground in the early stages of rounds? Abus Magomedov against Warley Alves. And Magomedov is starting to get to be pretty popular on this card. Where do we have him now? We've got him projected for 33% ownership. I don't know how you trust Abus Magomedov. There's clearly upside here because when he wins, it comes by quick finishes, but he's got no cardio. So if we look at the fights that Abus Magomedov has had in the UFC so far, UFC debut, he knocks out Dustin Stoltzfus, but he did it in 19 seconds. So we didn't learn all that much from him other than the fact that, hey, he hits guys really hard and he could kill them in an instant. Then he fights Sean Strickland in a main event that Strickland took on late notice. Magomedov wins the first round and looks fantastic. The wrestling looks good. The striking looks good. He looks powerful. He looks sharp. And then the second round starts, and dude's totally gassed. He's fighting in a 5-round main event with about 5 minutes of cardio. So Sean Strickland's fighting a punching bag in the second round. He's just totally able to take over. What happens in the next fight? Abus is taking on Caio Bahayo and just doesn't do anything. I don't know if he gassed out in the last fight, so he was concerned about his cardio, but instead he just gave himself no chance to win. He threw something like 13 strikes in the first round. What was the actual number? He landed 11. So Abus landed 7 significant strikes, and Caio Bahayo lands 11 significant strikes in the first round. And Abus, when you have bad cardio and you're throwing that little output in the first round of fights, you're just giving yourself no chance to win. And he still ends up gassing out in that fight, and Bahayo takes over in the later stages. So with that being the case, it's really hard for me to trust a chalky Abus Magomedov. He's very live for a first round finish in this fight. And on the other side, Warley Alves isn't particularly trustworthy in his own right. And he also has very poor cardio. He frequently gasses in the later stages of fights as well. But when we have 2 untrustworthy fighters and one of them is going to be really popular and the other one's going to be really contrarian, I'm going to lean towards the Warley Alves side, even though I think Magomedov is probably a little bit more likely to win. I think a win from Warley Alves is more likely to be on an optimal lineup than a win from Abus Magomedov in a fight that I do think could be fairly competitive. So I'm going to be overweight to the field on Warley Alves, project for 20% ownership. I have him about a third of my lineups right now. And on the other side, Abus, who's projected for 33% ownership, I only have him in a little bit over 20% of my lineup. So kind of flip-flopping what the field's expected to do with their exposures. Couple of fights left here to talk about, and this is also only a 12-fight card, so it's good that we didn't lose any fights at weigh-ins today, or else we would be looking at like an 11 or 10-fight card. Piero Rodriguez against Ariane Carnelossi, and this is my other bet that I have for the card. The line is gone, unfortunately. I bet Piero Rodriguez minus 170 on the money line. She opened up actually at like minus 120 or minus 130, depending what book you are looking at. I end up getting on a little bit after that at minus 170, and now Piero Rodriguez is anywhere from like minus 220 to minus 235 at the time I'm recording. And on paper, I think this is a very favorable matchup for Piera Rodriguez because Carnelossi has some of the worst takedown defense you'll ever see. 8% takedown defense for Ariana Carnelossi. She's very physically strong. She is jacked. She's got massive biceps. Doesn't help her in the takedown defense department. And Piera Rodriguez relentlessly shoots takedowns. She lands 3.31 takedowns per 15 minutes. So as a result, not only do I think Piera Rodriguez should win this fight with her wrestling and grappling, but I think there's a little bit of upside for DraftKings purposes as well. She's actually coming in at 29% projected ownership, which is a little bit disappointing to me. I was hoping she'd be really contrarian with the field maybe overlooking a women's MMA fight where she's priced at $8,800, which is something we typically see. Higher priced WMMA fighters, not all that popular, but she actually is projected for that 29% ownership. So I'm a little bit overweight to Piera Rodriguez, but if she wasn't popular, I was prepared to really get a good amount of exposure to her. Instead, I'm just slightly overweight because the field is getting there to some extent. I guess Carnelossi is live as an underdog just because she does have big power. Anytime this fight does take place on the feet, she is potentially live for a finish, which is more than we could say about a lot of the other punt options. But still, I bet Piera Rodriguez to win, and she is somebody who I like targeting for DFS as well. Carnelossi's only worth a couple of shots in GPPs, not something I'm going to be prioritizing at all. Alatang Hale against Kletzen Rodriguez. And for DFS purposes, I'm going to be on the Alatang Hale side, and this is why. Kletzen Rodriguez defends takedowns at a 63% clip, and Alatang Hale is very capable of shooting and landing takedowns. He lands 1.82 per 15 minutes. The problem is that he doesn't always aggressively look for his wrestling and grappling. He's capable, he just doesn't do it all that frequently. And you always get concerned about what the game plan of fighters might be coming into some of these fights, because if the fight takes place on the feet, Kletzen Rodriguez wins. I think he wins pretty handily. But if Alatang Hale goes to his wrestling, not only do I think he wins, but I think he put up a pretty decent DraftKings score, which the reason why I'm playing him in DFS this weekend is because if he comes in with that good game plan, he looks to wrestle, I think he land 3, 4, 5 takedowns and win a decision, maybe score 80 to 90 fantasy points, which on a slate like this where we are having issue finding salary savings, I think Alatang Hale could end up being somebody who differentiates the lineup. Also not all that popular. He's projected for 22% ownership, and another fighter that I'm currently overweight to. Kletzen Rodriguez, somebody I'm less interested in just because he is the more expensive fighter. And if he does win, it's going to be striking based. I don't really see him doing any wrestling and grappling. And I also don't think he has all that likely of a path to win by finish. So Alatang Hale in a competitive fight is my preferred target for DFS. Couple fights left here to talk about. Oh, no, just one fight left. And it is probably my least favorite fight on the entire card. Emily Dakot against Vanessa Demopoulos. On paper, very favorable matchup for Emily Dakot because she has 92% takedown defense, and Vanessa Demopoulos has basically no striking. So when Demopoulos wins fights, she has to generally either get the fight to the ground, and she is a good grappler, or it's just something where she could kind of win based on aggression and just striking output. But because Dakot is such a better striker on the feet and she has good takedown defense, I think the way this fight plays out is Dakot fends off the takedowns, probably puts up a pretty decent amount of significant strikes against Vanessa Demopoulos, maybe even lands 120 or so significant strikes. The problem with that is if she's only going to be striking and probably isn't going to get a finish, think of it this way. Even if there's a world where she lands 150 significant strikes, which is fairly unlikely, 150 strikes, 150 significant strikes, you get her at 300 total strikes. That would end up with a final DraftKings score of 90, which is okay. It's just not enough to win a tournament at Dakot's price point. So this is a fight I hardly have any interest in between Dakot and Demopoulos. I guess if I had to play a fight, it would be Demopoulos just because she is cheaper, but not a fight I really think that we need to be targeting. And that's going to do it for us today, guys. A little bit of a shorter video here because there are only there are only 12 fights on the card, but should be a good one. I think there's a lot of fun, interesting fights that are high variance that should make for interesting rooting interest. So hope you guys enjoy the card. There's going to be a break next week because there is no UFC card. If you haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, enjoy the card, and good luck, everybody.